Previously, on Tales of the Hunger Games. After a turbulent training session and an even more controversial set of interviews, the grand final began the next day in one of the most spectacular arenas in the history of the games. As usual, approximately a third of the tributes died within the first hour of the games, along with Yukon from 6, Drin from 9, Lumo from 3, and Glitch from 3, who were killed in separate incidents over the next 24 hours. In fact, all but the latter of this group were killed by the career pack that was formed by Optimo and Dazzle, both from 1, along with Magnus and Octavia, both from 2. However, a larger group consisting of Baffin from 4, Olive from 7, Net from 8, Tritica from 9, and Restoro from 12 had also formed, along with Thibaut and Begonia, both from 11, the latter of whom was allegedly pregnant during these games. Earlier that morning, Net realised that hazards were working their way west across the 5 different time zones, and after some disagreement, she convinced her allies to travel east with her in order to avoid the hazards that would later occur in the western zones of the arena. As noon passed, the group continued to walk quickly to the east through Texas, whilst paying particular attention to the top of the hill to their north, although they all seemed relieved to see nobody upon this hill or in any other direction. Yet just a minute after noon, some light winds began to pick up, which caused sand to fly up from the ground. Viewers could in fact see that this sand was being swept up by small tornadoes that were quickly forming around the group. Net shouted that they needed to hurry, and she sprinted ahead to the east, but within the seconds that followed, the others were lashed by these waves of sand. Viewers in Snow Square watched in excitement as the group started running east through the tornadoes. However, they had only been running for a few seconds when sand suddenly flew into Restoro's eyes. He shouted in pain and fell over, whilst clearly trying to not rub his eyes. Net briefly looked back, but as she too was hit by sand, she spluttered and shouted at the others to run east, which she proceeded to do. Olive and Baffin then followed her with the weapons and supplies, while still trying to shield their faces. As for Tritica, her sounds of anxiety grew louder as more and more of the sand whipped around her face, and she gasped as some flew up her nose. Yet just as she looked ready to continue east after Olive and Baffin, she suddenly heard the shouts of Restoro, who had just fallen back to the ground a few meters behind her. Tritica appeared to panic, and she looked back and then forwards, but as Restoro blindly shouted for help, she quickly turned and ran back towards him. Tritica squinted, her eyes closed, as she grabbed onto Restoro, who was already waving his arms about in desperation. She grimaced and hoisted Restoro up from the ground. He managed to support himself over her shoulder as they started running east, but he appeared to be shouting that he could not see. Yet Tritica rather surprisingly placed her hand over his eyes instead of her own, and she continually shouted, "You run," to Restoro for the next minute, as they headed through more sand and over the next shallow hill. Meanwhile, Olive and Baffin were still having some difficulty moving through the sandy hills after Net, but they were able to place a hand each over their faces, which prevented too much sand from entering their eyes, and they were able to continue running forwards. Baffin briefly looked back and saw Tritica almost tripping as she supported Restoro. He called ahead to Net to slow down, but as Olive looked back to see Baffin stopping, she was hit by a sudden gust of wind and slipped back, banging her head against a rock on the ground. Baffin shouted through the intense volume of the winds for Net to help, and she jolted around to see Olive's head bleeding as she lay on the ground. Net was now just 20 meters from the western edge of Louisiana's swamp, but she sprinted back, whilst Baffin tried to pull Olive up from the ground, although she appeared too heavy for him. Whilst Net and Baffin helped Olive to her feet, Tritica practically dragged Restoro to the east, even though he was now clearly in pain and shouting. Tritica encouraged him onwards with monosyllabic words, whilst Net and Baffin helped Olive up a sandy hill that led into the swamps of Louisiana. Almost a minute later, Net and Baffin practically collapsed with Olive onto the flat marshland of Louisiana, and although sand was still flowing towards them from the sandy hills to their west, they were able to cover themselves from this lesser amount. Olive winced in pain as blood poured from the back of her head, and Net told Baffin to help carry her east, away from the sand that was still blowing into the swamps. As the pair moved Olive, Tritica finally dragged Restoro into Louisiana before collapsing in exhaustion. Baffin looked back, and Net told him to help them whilst she stayed with Olive. As Baffin ran back, Olive painfully held on to the back of her head, but insisted she felt fine and that Net should help Tritica and Restoro. Net therefore helped Baffin to lead them east along this bridge of land until they were almost 100 meters into Louisiana. Whilst Net asked Tritica to open her eyes, Ristoro shouted that there was sand in his eyes, and Olive appeared to worry, but she held his hand and replied that they would get the sand out. Yet as Tritica proceeded to very gingerly open her eyes, Baffin alerted the others to an object that was coming down from the north with a ringing sound that he shouted to be a sponsor gift. With his eyes still closed, Ristoro asked in an anxious manner whose it was, and as it landed in the water by this land, Baffin said that it was for District 9. Tritica appeared surprised, but without further delay, Baffin grabbed the bag and handed it to her. She pulled out a small bottle that appeared to contain a clear liquid. Baffin asked what this was, and Tritica blindly felt around in the bag before pulling out a note that Baffin announced to read "Clarity is Power" from S. The others appeared confused, but Ristoro said that these must be eye drops. He explained that this liquid could be used to clean dirt from people's eyes and hence improve their vision. He then asked one of the others to pour some drops into his and Tritica's eyes, and Net moved towards Tritica, but she pointed towards Ristoro and insisted that Net helped him first. A tense silence followed in the arena, as Eugenia mentioned a previous debacle that had resulted from non-functioning eye drops, but after a few minutes of holding his eyes open and appearing to cry, Ristoro smiled and blinked his eyes before saying that he could see. Olive then checked on Tritica's vision, which seemed to have adequately improved. Ristoro looked around at the swamps, but as he turned back to the west to see the large tornadoes that were still passing through Texas, he asked in a daze how they had managed to run through them without being swept up. Olive replied that she had no idea, and Baffin added that they were lucky to all be alive. Once Tritica had managed to stand up again with the help of Olive, Ristoro embraced and thanked her for helping him through the tornado. She then smiled, tapped her chest twice, and placed her hand against his heart. Further east along the land, Net and Baffin were drinking some of their water. Olive approached and offered them some bread, which they accepted, whilst Olive said that Net had better be correct about the time zones. Yet seconds later, a cannon sounded, and both sets of these tributes quickly glanced towards each other. Meanwhile, the career pack was in the cornucopia clearing when the tornadoes started shortly after noon. Octavia had been unsuccessfully trying to convince the others to leave this clearing with her, but after she spotted and alerted them to a large tornado that was moving in a northeastern direction towards them, they finally agreed and grabbed their supplies and weapons before fleeing northeast. The tornado accelerated towards the pack, and Octo and Magnus led the way northeast through the cornfields, whilst Dazzle and Octavia ran after them, without appearing to pay any attention to each other. After almost 2 minutes, the boys entered the field of Iowa, and looked back towards the clearing as they waited for the girls. Optimo gasped at the size of the tornado, and stated that it looked even bigger in person, to which Magnus grinned, and replied that this was what his mother had said the night before the games. This produced laughter from viewers in Snow Square, and even Rubius, whilst Optimo looked back at him with an annoyed expression. Octavia then ran through the edge of the corn, and Optimo asked where Dazzle was. Octavia grinned, and responded that she did not know, but that Dazzle may have been sucked up by the tornado as she was too slow. Yet seconds later, Dazzle ran through the edge of the corn and glared at Octavia, after appearing to have heard this comment. Insults were exchanged between the girls until Optimo alerted them to movement that he could see on the Minnesota hill to the north. Meanwhile, Clara had been resting by the perimeter of North Dakota when the tornado started in Zone C. After noticing one forming through the valley of South Dakota and moving towards her, she yelped and sprinted east, before reaching the top of Minnesota's icy hill after just 2 minutes. Clara briefly rested, but soon began to shiver once more as she felt the cold temperatures around her. A few minutes passed, until she looked in detail at the Michigan lake, and Eugenia commented that she may be looking for Thibaut or Begonia, who was still hiding in the northern cave. Yet after appearing to not see them, Clara carefully made her way south down the Minnesota hill. During this time, Begonia peeked out from the cave and noticed Clara on the hill, which she brought to Thibaut's attention, but he replied that they did not need to worry about her. However, after looking back across the lake to the south, Begonia spotted the careers, and she quickly scurried further into the cave, before telling Thibaut what she had just seen. Viewers could see that the only person who did not appear to have noticed the careers approaching was Clara herself, who was focusing intently on not slipping on an extremely icy section of the hill. Yet as Magnus led the way north through Iowa and straight towards Clara, she finally turned around and yelped in terror when she spotted them approaching. Clara tried to climb back up the hill, but in her panic, she slipped and screamed as she tumbled down the hill, before landing with such speed that she slid into the field of Iowa. Whilst cheers in Snow Square raged for the careers and shouts of encouragement sounded from the District 10 supporters section, Clara painfully got to her feet and started running east. Amazingly, she managed to dodge the 2 arrows fired by Octavia before running the 100 meters east towards the icy lake of Wisconsin. However, when Clara was just 10 meters from this lake and appearing ready to dive, the careers had moved closer to her, and Octavia shot one more arrow that hit Clara's back. Begonia watched in anguish from the cave on the northern side of the lake as Clara fell to the ground and screamed in pain. Then Thibaut shuddered as he spotted Octavia running towards her with a knife. Octavia told Clara to say hello to Anna before bringing the knife over Clara, who gasped and screamed, although Optimo quickly grabbed onto Octavia's arm. She was visibly annoyed at this intrusion, but Optimo stated that Clara may know where other tributes were, and they could extract this information from her. Octavia gave Optimo a very dirty glare, and Rubeus joked that one should never get in her way when she's on a roll. Clara then kicked Octavia's knee, and as she tried to wriggle free, she called Octavia a word that was later censored, but Magnus quickly punched Clara back to the ground. Octavia held her knee in pain, whilst appearing extremely tempted to use her knife, but Magnus calmly told her to wait, before handing a knife to Optimo and telling him to find out whatever he could. Thibaut and Begonia watched in horror from the cave as Clara's cries turned into screams, and Begonia also started to cry. She noticed Magnus looking to the east, presumably for other tributes, whilst Dazzle was looking north towards the icy cliffs above the couple. Begonia shuddered and asked if the careers were also going to kill them, but Thibaut reassured her that they would not. Meanwhile, Dazzle was saying to Magnus that other tributes could be hiding in the caves to the north of the lake, and Begonia saw Dazzle gesturing in their direction. Begonia's breathing hastened as she held her stomach. Thibaut initially reassured her, but after a while he began to look west from the cave towards the Minnesota Hill. Clara's screams became even louder over the next minute, and Thibaut bluntly said that they needed to run up the hill to the west. Begonia looked back at him in bewilderment, and she began to breathe erratically and panic, but Thibaut quickly grabbed onto her and responded that if the careers came around this side of the lake, they would definitely be found, and that this could be their only way to escape in time. Begonia looked across the lake to see Clara's blood flowing through the snow, and she whimpered that she did not want to do this, but Thibaut grabbed her by the hand. He briefly looked across the lake to see that none of the careers were looking towards them, then said that this was their only chance, before running out of the cave with Begonia, and the couple sprinted west. Amazingly, none of the careers seemed to notice the couple at first, as they were all distracted at this moment by Optimo's efforts to make Clara tell them the location of Oregon. She was desperately saying that she had seen him in the east of the arena, and even offered to show them where she had seen him, but Rubeus pointed out that they would never fall for this lie. Yet a few seconds later, Dazzle looked back to the north and shouted as she spotted Thibaut and Begonia running west. As the other careers glanced up, Dazzle was already sprinting northwest along the shore of the Wisconsin Lake, towards the large ice plate in the west of this state, and Magnus sprinted after her. Clara gasped in fear, and pleaded for mercy once more as Octavia walked towards her with a knife, but Optimo quickly stabbed Clara's heart with the knife, which immediately sounded her cannon. As Octavia glared at Optimo, he snatched his spear from the ground and sprinted northwest after Dazzle and Magnus. Octavia swore under her breath as she watched Optimo running, but after a few seconds she sprinted after him. Whilst Thibaut and Begonia ran through the final 100 meters before the snowier eastern side of the Minnesota Hill, the latter yelped in terror when she saw the careers carefully making their way north across the ice plate. Yet Thibaut shouted at Begonia to keep running, and they reached the base of the hill just seconds later. As the couple began to ascend the hill, they both appeared relieved to not slip or fall back on the snow that Rubeus had stated to look perishable. Meanwhile, respectful applause sounded in Snow Square for Clara as the hovercraft came down to take her body. Yet as the craft flew from the arena, this applause morphed into cheers, with viewers clearly excited to see the careers gaining on Thibaut and Begonia. The couple continued sprinting up the hill with all the energy that they seemed to possess. Over the next minute, Begonia slowed down slightly, and she faltered 3 times, whilst breathing in exhaustion and saying that she could not go on, but Thibaut shouted at her during these times in a surprisingly forceful manner to keep moving. When they were just over halfway up the hill, Magnus and Dazzle reached its base, and the latter quickly readied an arrow in her bow, whilst the former excitedly waited and watched. Thibaut and Begonia were still climbing the hill, and neither of them noticed as Dazzle released the arrow. Begonia appeared to run out of breath at this time, and she rested for a second, until the arrow hit just a few meters down the hill. After glancing back to see that Dazzle had just shot this arrow, she screamed at Thibaut to hurry. He yanked Begonia by the hand and practically dragged her up the hill. Dazzle readied another arrow in her bow, but Magnus suddenly ran ahead. This caused Dazzle to jump, and she nearly shot her arrow by accident, but appeared to realize that Begonia and Thibaut had now run too far ahead for an arrow to reach them. She then ran after Magnus, whilst Optimo and Octavia reached them from behind. After just over a minute, Thibaut and Begonia reached the top of the hill, and Begonia appeared to cry with relief. However, after looking back to see that Magnus was already over halfway to the top of the hill, Thibaut pulled Begonia by the hand, and they ran west into a shallow, rocky valley that lay by the perimeter of North Dakota. Almost a minute later, the careers also entered North Dakota, with Octavia now leading the pack. Thibaut and Begonia were over halfway towards Montana, and even though Begonia was clearly lacking energy at this point, Thibaut shouted at her to keep running. Whilst excited viewers cheered in Snow Square, an aerial view showed that the careers were gaining on Thibaut and Begonia as they ran west. When the couple reached the edge of North Dakota just a minute later, Thibaut practically carried Begonia into the grassy northern field of Montana, whilst the careers had now moved to within 200 meters of them. Thibaut briefly stopped and looked around in apparent amazement at the fine views from this position, but Begonia quickly looked back to the approaching careers before grabbing Thibaut's hand and pulling himself into the forest with her. Begonia quickly darted between the trees as she led Thibaut south, without moving in any specific pattern or direction, except away from the approaching careers. Meanwhile, Oregon had returned to the forest when the lightning stopped earlier. After looking at his set of body paints and appearing pensive, he surprised several viewers by removing his jacket and throwing himself into a muddy puddle that had formed near where he slept, which turned his black clothes and light hair a dark brown. Oregon also applied some brown paint to his skin and placed ivy across his hair and clothes, which effectively camouflaged him against the surrounding ground, and cheers even sounded in Snow Square once the end result was shown. Upon hearing Clara's cannon and seeing the hovercraft collect her body from close to the east, Oregon lay down against a dirt hill within the centre of this forest, before placing light rocks on his torso and between his knees. He still appeared to be putting together some final touches to this camouflage, but after hearing movement to his north, he appeared to panic and shoved his hands into his pockets, then lay still upon the hill. After a minute of running south through the trees, Begonia and Thibaut started down the hill on which Oregon was hiding, but Thibaut slipped and tumbled down, before collapsing on some broken branches that lay just a few meters west of Oregon. Begonia gasped and cried in desperation as she saw Thibaut wincing in pain and grabbing onto his left knee, which was shown on a replay to have smacked against one of these branches. Begonia tried to help Thibaut up from the ground, and another camera showed Oregon opening his muddied eyelids behind the couple, before closing them as Thibaut trembled back up to his feet. Yet when Begonia helped Thibaut to quickly hobble further south, she shuddered after hearing the excited hoots of the careers coming from the north. Thibaut appeared as frightened as Begonia, but he whispered to her to run and that he would hide before finding her later, although she used a rather rude array of language to reject this idea. Yet as the sound of the careers continued towards them, Thibaut grabbed Begonia by the hand and pulled her south towards a thicker section of trees. Whilst the couple were hiding themselves behind two of these trees, the careers finally stopped at the top of the dirt hill, just 20 meters to the north of where Oregon was hiding. Octavia appeared ready to keep moving, but Optimo quickly suggested heading in different directions and broadening their search for Thibaut and Begonia. Magnus and Dazzle seemed content with this idea, and Octavia immediately headed in a southeastern direction, whilst the other three careers headed at other angles to the south. The atmosphere in Snow Square was tense over the next 2 minutes, as Thibaut and Begonia hid in fear on the southern sides of their trees. Optimo slowly walked south down the hill, and unknowingly passed just 2 meters to the west of Oregon, who briefly opened his eyes before slamming them shut when he saw Optimo gripping his spear. Thibaut and Begonia both gripped their daggers against their chests as Thibaut silently mouthed to Begonia that he loved her, and she nodded back as tears fell from her cheek. However, as Begonia looked to the west, past Thibaut, she quivered in shock and pointed to Magnus, who was unknowingly walking away from them. Thibaut looked back, and after seeing Magnus, he gestured for them to move around to the other side of their trees, so that they were out of Magnus's view if he were to look their way. Yet as the couple crept around their trees, they continued to look back to the southwest, and neither of them realized that Optimo had just spotted them from further up the hill. Cheers of excitement roared in Snow Square as Optimo widened his eyes, and he appeared surprised by how easily his targets had just become available. Optimo slowly pulled back his spear, but just as he looked ready to aim it at either Tibo or Begonia, Oregon opened his eyes from the hill behind. Oregon's hands were still in his pockets, and he grasped the gems that he had taken from the rocks in Idaho. Yet just as Optimo began to take a small run-up before throwing the spear, Oregon pulled a fistful of these gems from his pocket and shouted Optimo's name. Tibo, Begonia, and Optimo all jolted around, but before either of them could react, Oregon threw the entire handful of gems at Optimo's face. He screamed in pain and tripped forwards, before tumbling south down the hill, whilst Oregon began to clamber back up the hill in the opposite direction. Tibo and Begonia both seemed confused for a split second by what had just happened, but as Optimo fell towards them, Begonia gasped, grabbed Tibo's hand, and turned to run further south down the hill. However, Tibo pulled back, and Optimo crashed into a tree with a painful shriek just a few meters north of the couple, before grasping his face that had just been scratched and ingrained in many places by the gems. Tibo then ran forwards with his dagger held out, and Optimo held up a hand, but a second later, Tibo thrust the dagger into his neck. Begonia gasped as Optimo's cannon sounded, and Tibo hobbled back, grabbed her by the hand, and ran south down the hill, whilst the sound of cheers and jeers in Snow Square had allegedly reached a deafening level. Although Begonia was clearly distressed by Optimo's death, she helped Tibo run, and she stopped him from falling twice over the next minute. Begonia then shouted with excitement that she could see the edge of the forest, but a second later, when the couple passed a thick tree, a branch suddenly smacked round into their faces and knocked them to the ground. It was shown that when Optimo screamed, Octavia had jolted around and listened very carefully to the noise in this direction. She saw Tibo and Begonia running south through the forest ahead of her, and as they moved nearer, she picked up a branch, then hid behind a tree that they were due to pass. Whilst Begonia appeared to be concussed, Tibo groaned in pain, and Octavia grinned as she aimed an arrow towards him. Tibo tried to reach his dagger, which had fallen less than 2 meters away, but Octavia shot an arrow at his hand. As Tibo yelped in pain, Begonia stirred slightly, and Octavia let out a small laugh, before asking Tibo if he really thought he stood a chance of saving Begonia or the baby, the latter of which he said in a mocking voice. Tibo eyed Octavia with anger, and grunted painfully as he tried to move his hand, which was now almost completely impaled by the arrow. Octavia laughed again, and rhythmically walked back and forth as she placed another arrow in her bow. She then told Tibo that she was at least thankful to him for killing the mayor's son, and jokingly adding that she wished it were the rock girl instead, but that this pleasure would still be hers at least. Tibo once again tried to move his hand, and Octavia asked herself out loud which of them she would like to kill first. Yet before she appeared to have thought of an answer, Begonia lunged forwards and tackled Octavia around her knees. More cheers erupted in Snow Square, and Tibo shouted in encouragement as Octavia swore and fell to the side. Begonia also fell and landed next to Octavia, who quickly placed the arrow back in her bow. Begonia jumped towards Octavia, but when she was less than a meter away, Octavia released the arrow, and it flew straight into Begonia's heart. As Tibo let out a painful scream, Begonia's cannon sounded, and Octavia scurried back. Tibo shouted unintelligibly towards Octavia, whilst desperately trying to move his hand from the ground, when Dazzle crept out from behind the nearest tree. It was shown that she had been in this area of the forest when Octavia hit Tibo and Begonia with the tree branch. Dazzle had listened to what Octavia had said to them, and she quietly crept closer during this time, before hiding behind a nearby tree. Yet after hearing Octavia describe her as the rock girl, she crept even closer and withdrew a knife. Octavia got up and stared at Tibo, who was now screaming hysterically, but Dazzle silently moved out from behind the tree and sliced a knife across the tendons in the back of Octavia's feet. Octavia screamed as she fell to the ground, whilst Tibo was still sobbing, but now looking at her in bewilderment. Octavia then snarled around whilst gripping onto the back of her legs, and Dazzle punched her face with such force that she immediately fell unconscious. Tibo watched in shock as Dazzle turned towards him with her knife in hand, but before she appeared to have decided what to do with this knife, she suddenly spotted Magnus running silently up the hill from the southwest and straight towards her. It was seen by viewers that Magnus had run towards this commotion after hearing screams, and he watched from further down the hill when Dazzle cut Octavia's tendons, before running up the hill towards Dazzle. Tibo watched gormlessly through his tears as Magnus ran just a few meters to the east, without even appearing to notice him. In fact, during the later replay of this action, Rubius hypothesized that Magnus had been too preoccupied with chasing Dazzle to notice that he had just run past Thibaut. Magnus continued to threaten and shout obscenities at Dazzle as he chased her past the location where Oregon had been hiding. Magnus was shown to start gaining on Dazzle, but after running through a thick section of trees and becoming hidden from his view, she suddenly jolted to the southeast. Dazzle then ran for another minute before almost falling down a rocky hill and into the valley of South Dakota. Yet she held back at the final moment and gripped onto a tree at the eastern edge of Montana's forest, whilst holding a knife out and silently looking around for any sign of Magnus. However, viewers could see that he had simply continued up the hill in a northeastern direction and was now nearing the northeastern edge of Montana's forest. Over the next 5 minutes, the hovercraft entered the arena and collected Optimo's body, before moving south to collect that of Begonia. Thibaut screamed in anger and sorrow as he saw the craft, even tried to stop the Deathclaw from taking her body, which caused him to be tasered, and as he lay shaky on the ground, Begonia's body was finally removed. In the moments following Begonia's death, it is reported that protests quickly occurred throughout the capital, with many of those involved clearly angry about the death of a pregnant tribute, and for these games to be ended now, while some even called for the Hunger Games to be completely scrapped. This also led to widespread violence occurring that night, with many prolific Capitol buildings, including the Dalton Studios and Gull Manor, being heavily damaged by these outraged citizens. Thibaut struggled to breathe for the next minute, but as Octavia began to stir on the ground nearby, he suddenly looked over, and Eugenia joked that he appeared to have forgotten she was there. Thibaut stomped towards Octavia and knocked her unconscious once more, before rifling through her pockets and finding some rope. Thibaut grabbed this rope and chopped a few sections with his dagger that he used to tie together Octavia's hands, then her legs, and then her neck against the nearest tree. Thibaut rested by this tree and snarled in disgust at Octavia, who occasionally stirred in her slumber. After a while, she awoke and darted her eyes around as she realized that she was now tied up, until Thibaut saw that she had awoken. He silently snarled at Octavia, but she looked back at him with a slight grin, before telling him to fight her properly, although he immediately roared at her to shut up and readied his dagger. Thibaut looked down again in anger, and Octavia briefly seemed concerned by this weapon, but she then told him to stab her, and that she was not scared of him. Thibaut yelled once more at Octavia to be quiet, and he then appeared to be thinking deeply, but she casually replied that no amount of shouting would bring Begonia back. Thibaut lunged forwards and smacked Octavia's head against the tree, before pulling off her boots and stuffing her socks in her mouth, then fastening her mouth shut with more rope as she slumped against the tree. For the next 2 hours, Thibaut silently looked away from Octavia, who remained unconscious and barely moved for most of this time. Tears occasionally fell down Thibaut's cheeks as he mumbled to himself about Begonia, while scraping his dagger along the floor. Meanwhile, Dazzle had climbed down the valley of South Dakota and quickly headed southeast, before entering Iowa and running east until she reached the redwood forest of Pennsylvania. For most of this time, she rested in exhaustion and carefully looked back west into the large field, but also helped herself to some of the water and food that she had secretly pocketed the night before. Meanwhile, Magnus had roamed east through North Dakota, where he appeared to be hunting for Dazzle, but to no avail. He also looked to the south from this high ground, but Dazzle had already travelled too far to the east, and he therefore failed to see her. As for Oregon, he had continued to sprint up the hill and then to the west after Optimo's death. He initially appeared annoyed to have left his supplies behind, and he briefly stopped running and turned back, which caused gasps in Snow Square. However, he appeared to come to his senses a minute later, and turned back to the west again, until he entered the dense forest of Washington, before travelling west and eventually settling close to the perimeter. Meanwhile, Baffin, Restero, Tritica, Net, and Olive had looked out carefully from the swamps of Mississippi after hearing Clara's cannon sound, but when they saw the hovercraft collecting her body and movement on the hill to their north, Olive called for them to keep running east. They continued across the marshland and into Alabama, where Baffin appeared to be the only member of this group to spot a few large crocodiles swimming towards them from the north, but he said nothing and quietly continued. Then after 5 minutes, they had arrived in the jungle of northern Florida. The group rested within some thick palm trees that lay next to the river, and all of them, but Tritica and Net in particular, seemed bothered by the humid atmosphere of this jungle. Yet they each consumed some water and fruit, which kept them adequately nourished and hydrated as they rested. During this time, they also heard the cannons of Optimo and Begonia, and there was some discussion regarding who these cannons belonged to. Most of the group appeared to believe that at least one of the cannons belonged to Thibaut or Begonia, whilst all of them except for Tritica appeared to believe that Oregon had been killed by the careers. In the late afternoon, Octavia woke up once more, but she soon realized that her ability to speak was hindered by the socks that Thibaut had placed inside her mouth. As she mumbled unintelligibly, he looked back and snarled, before getting up and walking south. Octavia appeared to be pleading with Thibaut once again, and he gripped the dagger even tighter in his hand as he walked away. Once Thibaut was out of sight, Octavia desperately tried to free herself from the ropes, but she quickly realized that this was of no use. Whilst Thibaut walked further towards the southern end of the forest, Eugenia asked Rubeus what Octavia could do to escape, and several camera angles were analysed, but he replied that she needed to do whatever she could for Thibaut to keep her alive. After walking down the hill, he sat by a tree just 20 meters from the forest's edge, and held his head in his hands as he wept. He then shouted several controversial statements against President Gall, and this footage was quickly muted. However, when Thibaut finished shouting, he seemed to notice the winds that were picking up behind him, and after looking back, he gasped at the intensity of the wind lashing his face. Thibaut carefully got up and was almost knocked over, but he quickly grabbed onto the branch of a nearby tree and looked around in surprise at this sudden change in the weather. Yet as he looked west, he failed to notice a tall, frail tree to his north being pulled up from its roots. Some viewers in Snow Square cheered as the tree started falling towards Thibaut, but he heard its branches crashing past those of another tree before jolting around and sprinting east. Thibaut was in fact hit on the hand by a small branch of this tree, and this caused him to fall and tumble down the hill, but when he stopped just a few meters below, it was clear that he had only received a minor scratch. He frantically looked at this hand, which was previously shot by Octavia's arrow, but he appeared relieved that it was not badly hurt. Yet as Thibaut looked ahead from this lower point on the hill, his eyes widened when he spotted the bubbling rainbow spring of Wyoming to the south, with waters that were now choppy from the winds. Eugenia stated that he seemed mesmerized by the colors of the water, but as Rubeus began to talk about the most beautiful arenas that he could think of, Thibaut snarled and stormed back to the north. Some small trees fell near Thibaut as he headed up the hill, but he did not even seem to notice them, and within 2 minutes he had reached Octavia, who was still tied to the tree and avidly looking around at the nearest trees, some of which were falling from the strong winds. Octavia's eyes widened as she saw Thibaut stomping towards her, but Eugenia commented that due to the socks in her mouth, it was difficult to read her facial expression. Thibaut then checked that Octavia's hands and feet were all still tied together, and after seeming certain that they were safely fastened, he sliced the rope at the back of the tree that was attached around Octavia's neck. She immediately tried to get to her feet, but was quickly yanked back to the ground when Thibaut tugged on this rope. He proceeded to walk down the hill and pull Octavia with this rope, which caused her to stumble and fall, then moan in pain whenever her head crashed against the ground or a tree. Along with many viewers in Snow Square, Rubeus objected to Thibaut's uncaring way of treating his niece, and he even stated that it would have been more appropriate for Thibaut to kill Octavia when he had the chance. She also seemed to be objecting as she was pulled further down the hill, but with the socks in her mouth and the loud winds around them, Thibaut was unable to hear her. He then reached the southern edge of the forest where he had rested earlier, and as he marvelled at the colours of the steaming water in Wyoming spring, Octavia looked around before screaming and wriggling in horror as these sounds were muffled. As Rubeus objected once more, and the sounds of protest in Snow Square grew louder, Thibaut dragged Octavia even closer to the small stone hill that led down into the spring. With her limbs tied together, Octavia was unable to get up from the ground, and Thibaut led her to the very edge of this stone hill, then kicked her in the face. He pulled the socks from Octavia's mouth, and she immediately gasped and spluttered blood. She briefly begged for mercy, but Thibaut kicked her in the stomach, and this caused her to roll down the hill towards the spring. Yet Thibaut held onto the rope, and this stopped Octavia from falling further. She screamed in anguish as she caught her breath, but the wind appeared to blow some of the toxic fumes from the spring towards her mouth, and she coughed and spluttered some more before screaming for help from Magnus. Thibaut ignored Octavia, and as she tried to get to her feet, he He walked back to the nearest tree and tightly fastened the other end of the rope around its trunk. He then returned to Octavia, who had just managed to stand up, but was now screaming for mercy as the boiling waters steamed beneath. Octavia tried to hop back towards Thibaut, but he quickly pulled out his dagger and held it over the rope, whilst glaring at Octavia, and she quickly stopped moving. Thibaut looked at her with a pensive expression, and Octavia tried to beg for mercy once more, but he shouted at her to shut up, and pushed the dagger into the rope, which immediately silenced her. Without saying a word, Thibaut continued to glare at Octavia. Rubeus was clearly annoyed, and asked if this was really necessary, whilst fights were allegedly breaking out in Snow Square between the supporters of Districts 2 and 11. After a minute, Octavia was still crying, and even though Thibaut had told her to be quiet, she begged for mercy once more, stating that she had to kill Begonia, and that she honestly did not want to, even claiming that she had only wished to put on a show for the capital. Yet Thibaut snarled at Octavia, and interrupted by telling her to not dare to lie to him. Octavia quivered and coughed as more fumes floated towards her. Then Thibaut told her that she had just taken away the only person who had ever made him happy. Octavia repeated that she was sorry, before offering Thibaut her supplies, an alliance, and a range of other prospects if he forgave her. Yet Thibaut did not respond to what Octavia was saying, and he silently snarled at her as she coughed even more violently, before leaning down and bursting into tears as more fumes floated towards her. Thibaut watched in repulsion, and Rubeus urged him to put Octavia out of her misery, whilst Eugenia was cringing behind her hands. Even the fights in Snow Square seemed to subside as many of those involved anxiously awaited Thibaut's next move. After almost 30 seconds, Thibaut looked ready to bring the dagger down onto the rope, when Octavia appeared to notice this. Yet as she slowly looked back up towards him, her cries gradually morphed into laughter. As Thibaut looked up at Octavia, she slowly threw her head back and cackled in amusement as she noticed the confusion on his face. Thibaut stood speechless for the next 10 seconds, but just as he looked ready to say something, Octavia managed to shout through her laughter that killing her would never bring back Begonia or the baby, before rolling her head back once more with laughter. Yet Thibaut remained calm and simply nodded, then replied that this was true, but that it would bring some justice to this darn nation. He then chopped the dagger down onto the rope, and Octavia screamed with laughter and pain as she tumbled down the stone hill towards the boiling waters. Thibaut watched Octavia crash into the water, and her laughter was quickly replaced by screams, although the steam that emanated from her body masked the sight of her burning flesh. Thibaut calmly watched as Octavia's screams slowly quietened, and within a minute her cannon had sounded. After the hovercraft removed the remains of Octavia's torso, Thibaut walked back up the hill and into the forest of Montana, where he quietly rested and drank some water. As the sun set, Thibaut suddenly burst into tears, and for the rest of the evening he quietly looked up to the sky without moving. Meanwhile, in the jungle of Florida, the humid temperatures had tired the tributes who were resting there. Ristoro and Tritica therefore agreed to keep watch for the next 2 hours, whilst Net, Baffin, and Olive slept nearby. Ristoro and Tritica were clearly tired and hardly spoke to each other, but instead looked towards the large trees and bushy plants around them. After almost 10 minutes, Ristoro began to speak about what he thought it would be like to live in a land as hot as this, and Tritica quietly listened as he mentioned the cold winters of District 12. He also asked Tritica about District 9's climate, and she gave some short but informative answers about the warm temperatures and tornadoes that occurred throughout the year. Ristoro then asked if the barns of District 9 kept the population safe from the tornadoes. Tritica at first seemed slightly hesitant to respond, but she soon spoke slowly about a recent tornado that had occurred, which saw her and several friends having to sprint to shelter in a nearby barn. Tritica seemed slightly dazed as she spoke about this experience, and Eugenia noted that Ristoro was watching her carefully. He felt the tree behind him and slowly scratched his finger against its bark, before asking if this had been more or less terrifying than the events in the barn at the end of District 9's games. Rubeus laughed in surprise, and several gasps were heard throughout Snow Square as Tritica stared blankly towards Ristoro, but he continued to slowly scratch the tree with one hand, before reassuringly touching Tritica's arm with his other hand. She gulped as she looked down and breathed, but Ristoro took her hand, and she looked back to him. He added, "Trauma thrives in silence," then asked once more about the end of these games, all while still scratching the tree behind. Tritica appeared to have trouble summoning the energy to speak, but after a minute, she stuttered as she slowly recounted the final showdown, starting with the realization that the aliens were chasing her, Semolina, and Rye. Tritica then spoke about their arrival in the barn and how they had boarded up the doors before the aliens had bashed against them. Yet Rubius noted that, interestingly, Tritica gave some inaccurate details of these events, even saying that the aliens were white instead of green. Ristoro continued to scratch against the tree as he asked about the moment the aliens entered the barn. Tritica was now sweating and having trouble breathing, although Ristoro held her hand and she very slowly proceeded to recall this event. Yet as Tritica recounted watching Rye and Semolina being killed, she gradually spoke faster and faster, and even in a more animated fashion, until bursting into tears as she mentioned being covered in the aliens' internal organs. Ristoro held Tritica against his shoulder as she sobbed. After a few seconds, she vomited next to his leg, before breathing deeply, and Ristoro passed her the nearest water bottle. Tritica took a few minutes to wash out her mouth and compose herself, but as she finally looked back to Ristoro, he asked if she felt better. Tritica was clearly perplexed by this question, and she blinked erratically for a few seconds, but appeared to surprise herself by answering that she did not feel so dark, and after smiling back at her, Ristoro finally stopped scratching the tree. Tritica gave him a very weak smile in return, but she then reached forward very slowly and gripped onto his t-shirt. Ristoro looked down in some confusion, then up to Tritica, but viewers could see that she was looking over his left shoulder to a thick black snake that had just slithered out from within a tree behind him. Just as Ristoro looked ready to ask what Tritica was doing, she suddenly pulled him forwards. Upon a replay, it was shown that the snake had lunged towards Ristoro's neck a split second before Tritica pulled on his t-shirt, but because he was moved, the snake only bit the jacket over his shoulder. Tritica jumped up and grabbed the snake by the tail. Then, just as it looked like it was ready to turn towards her, she smacked its head against the tree. Ristoro jumped and let out a small yelp as this happened, which immediately awakened Baffin, Net, and Olive, the latter of whom grabbed her axe before jumping to her feet. Ristoro glanced around and saw an identical snake slithering down from a nearby tree, and he grabbed his water bottle from the ground, then pulled Tritica by the hand. As the pair began to run north, Baffin and Net quickly got to their feet, whilst Olive led the way with her axe, that she forcefully slashed through some large plants that were on the path ahead. As Tritica ran with Ristoro, she shouted that she had seen the snakes in the White Room, and Ristoro glanced towards her, but simply ran ahead without asking any more. Olive was still pushing her way north, and Net shouted that there was a river ahead, but just after saying this, a snake suddenly fell onto her from the nearest tree. Net screamed, and Olive jolted around to see the snake hanging off the fabric of t-shirt over Net's collarbone. Olive quickly sliced her axe at the snake, which chopped its body in half without even scraping Net. As Tritica and Ristoro ran towards them from the south, Olive quickly grabbed Net from the ground, and these four tributes appeared to hear Baffin shout that he could see the river. He was almost bitten by another snake, but ran ahead and dived into the flowing water, whilst the others sprinted after him. Another snake also landed on Tritica a few seconds later, but before it had slithered to her neck, she effortlessly yanked it away, and within 10 seconds, all 5 of the group had jumped into the relative safety of the river. Although a current was leading them east, it was relatively weak, and after being carried only 200 meters at most, the group reached the shallower ground of the river's northern bank and waded to the shore before collapsing in exhaustion. Yet after just 10 seconds, Tritica said that they needed to get out of this jungle, as she did not want to be bitten by more snakes on this side of the river, and some viewers seemed rather surprised with this sudden initiative from Tritica, with Rubius jokingly calling her bossy. However, none of the group appeared to disagree, and they quickly headed north through the jungle, although fortunately for them, there were no snakes present on this side of the river, and within 2 minutes they had entered the hills of Georgia. They briefly rested and drank some of their water, until Baffin suddenly announced that he could see water, and he pointed north toward the cove of Connecticut in the distance, which he claimed could contain fish. Ristoro then added that they had accidentally left their food bag back in the jungle, and that they needed to continue in this direction if they wanted to eat that night. For the next 20 minutes, the group navigated the sloping ground, gorse bushes, and small trees as they headed north through Georgia, South Carolina, and then North Carolina. They all remained relatively silent during this time, and as they entered Virginia, Olive said that they would need to be careful when they entered the forest ahead. Yet just as she said this, Baffin looked around and appeared to notice 3 large moose that were stood halfway up the hill to their west and staring intently towards them. Baffin immediately glanced away from the moose and said quietly that they needed to move ahead as quickly as possible. Restorer asked why, but before Baffin could answer, Tritica stopped and jerked around, then screamed as one of these moose suddenly charged down the hill towards them. All 5 tributes ran north without delay as the other 2 moose followed down the hill. Yet one of these moose quickly lost its footing and fell faster than the others. This moose was so close to hitting Tritica that its hoof passed through her hair, although she did not appear to notice and kept running north, whilst the other moose continued down the hill. It crashed into the perimeter a few seconds later, which created a loud electronic buzzing and a bright light upon the perimeter that juxtaposed against the darkness of the incoming sunset. Yet as the group continued running north and the 2 other moose ran east towards them, Net suddenly tripped and yelped as she hit the ground. Tritica, Ristoro, and Baffin had been running ahead of Net and therefore did not see her, but Olive quickly turned and ran back to Net, who was now coughing and gripping her neck. Yet just as Olive was about to help Net to her feet, she suddenly saw the moose running through the last few meters of undergrowth before Net. Olive gasped and chucked her axe at the moose's head, which sprayed blood across both girls as it fell past them, whilst Olive helped Net to her feet, while she continued to splutter in pain. As Olive spotted the other 3 in their group reaching the forest of Maryland to their north, the 2 other moose collided with the perimeter, which caused 2 more loud sounds and bright lights to rise through the perimeter. Once the group were all in the safety of the forest, they walked north and the darkness of night set in. Rubius informed viewers that the squirrels in this forest were only interested in attacking lone tributes, and therefore this group were fortunate to be safe on this occasion. However, this did not stop the squirrels in the forest of eastern New York from squeaking loudly as the group passed them. This even appeared to cause some communal panic between the tributes, and they sprinted through the final 200 meters of the forest and almost collapsed onto the rocks in the south of Connecticut. Although it was dark, Baffin was clearly delighted to be by this water, whilst Net pointed out the beach within the northern side of New Hampshire. As the squirrels continued squeaking within the forest to their south, Olive suggested that they moved around the edge of this forest and towards the beach. They proceeded to do this, before finally resting in exhaustion on the beach, although Olive and Net both seemed more interested in the rocks of Maine that lay next to this beach. Yet just as Olive was about to climb these rocks, she was suddenly sponsored with a sharp silver axe, and over the next hour she threw it against several trees at the edge of the forest in Vermont that lay to the west of the water. Eugenia noticed that Olive was angrily mumbling to herself during this time, and regularly looking over at Net, who appeared tired as she sat on the beach with Tritica. Meanwhile, Baffin and Restero went fishing in the water of southern Maine, from which they managed to catch several of a fish called bass, that they cooked over the grill, and the group then ate together, whilst Olive kept watch with her axe. As the sun was setting, Dazzle rested in the forest of Pennsylvania, where she kept a lookout over the field to her west, whilst drinking water, eating, and quietly talking to herself about what she knew of her remaining opponents. When the larger group began to head through the hills of Georgia, Dazzle was delighted to be sponsored with some armor that she quickly placed on her torso and tested with her knives, which failed to even pierce the armor. Once the sun had fully set, Dazzle began to hear the squirrels squeaking to the north, in the forest of New York, and she appeared unsure of what to do for a while, but eventually headed towards this sound at a very slow pace, whilst holding her knives at the ready. After appearing to decide that it was best to not move too close to the squirrels, Dazzle rested within the upper branches of one of the tallest trees of New York, just 300 meters to the south of Connecticut, before using some of the rope in her pocket to tie her legs and body around the tree. As for Magnus, he had returned to the cornucopia clearing before sunset, where he angrily practiced with some of the remaining weapons. Upon hearing the sounds and lights against the eastern perimeter, Magnus suddenly stopped practicing and paused briefly, before grabbing a spear, sword, and some knives, then grinning as he walked east towards the hills of Virginia. After passing through these hills and inspecting the eastern perimeter, Magnus appeared to realize that the lights were caused by the 3 moose, which now formed a burned pile of carcasses in this location. He seemed slightly annoyed, and Eugenia said it was obvious that he was expecting to find other tributes, but he headed north along the eastern perimeter, then rested in the forest of New Jersey. As for Oregon, he remained deep in the western forest of Washington, where he initially covered himself with the dirt of the ground. Yet when Oregon's hunger and thirst set in, the sun set, and he began to shiver. Rubeus added that the cold was likely worse for him as he no longer had his jacket. Whilst Oregon tried rubbing his arms for warmth, he even begged to the sky for help, but he had already received a sponsor gift. He also appeared scared by the distant roars of large blood-guzzling bears in the forests of Oregon to his south, which viewers could see to now be roaming in his direction. The focus remained on Oregon for the next 30 minutes, as Eugenia asked Rubeus what could be done to save oneself from a situation like this, and if there was any chance of Oregon winning. Yet Rubeus responded that the odds were definitely not in his favour at this stage in the games, and that he would walk naked down the Grand Parade if Oregon won, which produced laughter and humorous applause in Snow Square. However, just minutes after Eugenia shifted the focus to Dazzle, Rubeus returned to Oregon, who was now ripping off thinner branches from the nearest trees. Eugenia asked why he was taking out his anger on the trees, but Rubeus replied that he might be trying to use them for warmth. In fact, Oregon soon placed himself within this pile of light branches, and Eugenia checked his vital signs to show that his internal body temperature had increased back to an almost normal level. Oregon closed his eyes and proceeded to breathe slowly, presumably in an effort to calm himself, although his breathing soon slowed even more, and Rubeus commented that he appeared to be falling asleep, to which Eugenia replied that, to be fair, his branch bed did look cosy. A few quiet roars echoed through the forest as Oregon lay asleep, but after 20 minutes, it was noticed that his skin was gleaming in the moonlight, and Eugenia asked if he had developed a fever, which could have triggered a cold sweat. She and Rubeus continued to focus on Oregon as sweat dropped from his forehead, and he began to stir, before suddenly jolting up and gasping in shock. The camera quickly panned out of this forest to show that a large line of fire was moving east from the perimeter of Washington and heading straight towards Oregon. He swore and quickly stumbled to his feet, but tripped against a tree and appeared to feel pain when his hand hit one of the hot branches. However, Oregon got back up and began sprinting east, away from the fire. His supporters in Snow Square cheered in encouragement, and he quickly found a path through the trees that was allowing him to distance himself from the fire. Yet 10 seconds later, Oregon suddenly came to a stop and gasped in horror as he noticed another large fire to his east that was also travelling towards him. He briefly spluttered on the smoke that was flowing his way, but pulled up his t-shirt over his mouth, and after looking back to the other fire, he sprinted south. As Oregon ran, it appeared that he may be about to outrun the fires on each side, but Rubeus asked if he had forgotten about the bears that were still roaming around northern Oregon. Eugenia then giggled and noted that Oregon's name was the same as the state that he was about to enter, to which Rubeus asked her how much champagne she had drunk so far that evening. A minute later, Oregon ran south into Oregon, but the fires were closing in fast on both sides, with trees around him catching fire and some falling to the ground, whilst his breathing was clearly becoming strained from the copious amounts of smoke in the air. As Oregon ran, a burning tree suddenly fell in front of him, but he jumped over its trunk and continued south while spluttering on. 20 seconds later, the burning branch of another tree suddenly fell towards Oregon. He did see it as it fell from above, but just as he looked ready to throw himself to the side, he tripped and fell to the ground. Oregon howled in pain as the burning branch covered his body, but he quickly wriggled his way from beneath it, before limping up and patting the flames over his body as he continued running south. The camera panned out of this forest once more, and showed that the fire only burned 20 more meters to Oregon's south, which caused his supporters to cheer as he stumbled towards his safe ground. Oregon continued limping south, and after passing through the smaller fires on the edge of the inferno, he smiled in relief and fell flat on his face, injured and exhausted, but alive. Oregon's eyes remained closed for the next 30 seconds as he lay upon the ground, but his eyebrows soon began to furrow as he heard something loud approaching. He then turned onto his back and looked up, before screaming at the sight of a large brown furry bear. Oregon tried to scurry up to his feet, but before he could even move, the bear roared and clawed its paw down against his right cheek. Oregon yelped and grabbed onto his cheek, but quickly got up to his feet. After avoiding another attempted swipe from this bear's claws, he fled south, whilst his cheek started bleeding across the separate cuts. The bear slowly ran after Oregon as he continued limping south, and he managed to put some more distance between them, often jolting around to check that the bear was not too close. Yet as he looked back again, he failed to see another bear running towards him from within a set of trees to the west. Oregon saw this second bear at the final moment, and he tried to push himself back, but the bear had already brought its claws down against Oregon's neck, and as blood splurted out, he fell to the ground. Oregon still tried to get back up to his feet, but the second bear immediately lunged towards his neck. The other bear then joined, and they both took large bites from Oregon's neck, which caused more frantic bleeding. As Oregon's feet gradually stopped shaking, respectful applause in Snow Square sounded, along with his cannon a short while later. Meanwhile, on the beach of New Hampshire, concerns were raised by Tritica regarding the safety of staying on this beach when a wave could travel in and drown them. However, Net responded that the other tributes would probably not dare travel to this side of the arena, and that as long as they travelled far enough to the west before sunrise, they would avoid the wave that followed. Soon after Oregon's cannon sounded, Olive appeared worried, and suggested that they get some rest for the next day. Nobody argued with this point, and Olive asked Net to join her in keeping watch, to which she agreed. Tritica and Ristoro moved to the bottom of the rocks in Maine, where they lay down close to each other. Ristoro looked up at the stars, but gradually noticed that Tritica was looking towards him, and he turned towards her as well. Ristoro appeared to be thinking of something to say, when Tritica slowly thanked him for helping her earlier that day. Before Ristoro could respond, she continued that he was correct about trauma thriving in silence, and that it was easy to forget this when one was already in the darkness. Ristoro asked if Tritica felt better, to which she replied that she felt a little better, but that she would see how she felt if she managed to live beyond sunrise. Ristoro smiled back, held out his hand, and said that he hoped she would feel better for as long as she lived. Tritica grinned slightly as she looked at Ristoro's hand, before reaching out to her own and holding his hand. The pair simply looked into each other's eyes for the next minute, until Ristoro stated that he wished they had met in a different life. Tritica smiled and ran her hands through Ristoro's wavy hair, then pointed up to the stars with her own hand, and replied, "Same stars, different people." The pair embraced and held their arms around each other as they looked off into the moonlit water ahead, before eventually falling asleep shortly before midnight. Meanwhile, Baffin said that before he slept, he wanted to take some fish from the water. Olive asked if he thought it was a good idea to fish when it was dark, but he replied that he could have the fish ready for them to eat in the morning. Olive said nothing as Baffin entered the water, although Net whispered to her to not eat anything he brought back, and Olive nonchalantly stated that she knew. Eugenia then described this as justified suspicion, and Rubeus replied that the Alliance implosions were always his favourite part of the games. Baffin entered the water, but instead of hunting the fish, he looked ahead towards the perimeter for almost a minute, before raising his gaze to the stars above and quietly beginning to cry. Baffin then lay on his back in the water, and for the next few minutes he proceeded to speak out loud to his mother, although records showed that she had died in a harbour attack 4 years prior, and Rubeus asked why all the younger tributes were speaking to dead people. Through his tears, Baffin spoke quietly, and it was therefore difficult for Rubeus and Eugenia to understand what he was saying, but he seemed to mention that he missed his mother, and that as she watched him from whichever star she now lived upon, he hoped that he was making her proud. After a while, Baffin seemed to come to his senses, and he used his trident to target a few of the base fish, which he took back to the girls. As Net eyed the fish, Baffin agreed with Olive that he would take watch halfway through the night, then he headed towards the rocks of Maine, and fell asleep soon after. Once Baffin was out of earshot, Olive said that she doubted he would strike first, but that they should still be careful. Net nodded in agreement, and Olive spoke about the remaining tributes and their chances of attacking. As she mentioned Magnus's ability with swords, Net burst into tears. Olive glanced over and appeared confused, whilst Net held her head in her hands and quickly apologized for this outburst, but Olive asked if she was all right. Net shook her head, before simply responding that she did not want to die, and that she was scared. As Net cried, Olive held her hand and told her to breathe, adding that she too was scared, and they just had to try to survive. Net still seemed forlorn, but Olive mentioned that even though her sister, Hazel, had not won the 95th Hunger Games, their family and all of District 7 were proud of what she had done. Net was still crying, but she seemed to be listening to Olive, who smiled and added that their legacies, at least, would last forever. The girls continued to keep watch on the beach until midnight, whilst their allies slept nearby. At midnight, Horn and Plenty played, and the portraits of Optimo from 1, Octavia from 2, Glitch from 3, Oregon from 6, Clara from 10, and Begonia from 11 were all shown, which left only 8 tributes remaining. Dazzle from 1, Magnus from 2, Baffin from 4, Olive from 7, Net from 8, Tritica from 9, Thibaut from 11, and Restoro from 12. After these portraits were shown, Magnus whispered to himself which tributes were still alive. He then stayed in the forest of New Jersey, and did not even appear tired over the early hours of the morning. He often looked north along the perimeter during this time, even though it was now dark, and Eugenia asked if Magnus knew that the large group were hiding to his north, to which Rubeus replied that he was gifted at sniffing out runts, and so he most likely knew that some were nearby. As for Dazzle, she slept in the heights of the large tree in the forest of New York, where she occasionally awakened during the night, and looked out from this spot in different directions. When she awoke shortly before midnight, she glanced around, and did not seem to pay much attention to her surroundings, yet as Dazzle frowned and turned back to the north, towards the moonlit beach of New Hampshire, Eugenia excitedly stated that she had definitely seen something. Dazzle looked to the north for a little longer, before carefully climbing down from the tree, and slowly travelling north along the eastern edge of New York's forest, then into that of Vermont as the portraits were shown. When Dazzle neared the western side of the beach of New Hampshire, she smiled as she appeared to notice Olive waking Restoro and Tritica and asking them to keep watch. However, Dazzle appeared worried as she looked ahead before moving slightly to the north, until she was just 5 meters from the perimeter. As Dazzle climbed another tree, Rubeus stated that this was in fact rather clever, as she would not be upon the path between this beach and the forest. Meanwhile, Thibaut had stayed on the edge of the spring in Wyoming following Octavia's murder. He barely ate or drank for the rest of the day, but simply looked out and occasionally cried as it got dark. When Begonia's portrait was shown at midnight, he burst into tears, and carelessly shouted some more obscenities towards the capital, but the focus was quickly moved from him, and so, fortunately, these incorrect opinions were not heard on Capital TV for too long. The first few hours of the third day went by relatively uneventfully, with all tributes either sleeping or remaining still. Tritica and Restoro spoke to each other about the other tributes as they kept watch over Olive, Net, and Baffin from the rocks of Maine. At one moment, Restoro even suggested leaving the beach, and Tritica appeared to contemplate this idea, but she soon stated that they were more likely to beat the other 3 tributes with the help of Olive, Net, and Baffin, and so they should stay with them for now. Thibaut appeared unable to sleep, and after an hour he moved east, travelling through the valley of South Dakota, then through the field of Iowa and Illinois, before entering Indiana. Yet shortly after reaching this state, he appeared tired once more, and within minutes he was lying against a tree, but struggling to sleep, due to the tears that were falling from his eyes. Once 4 hours had passed since midnight, the first light entered through the east of the arena, and Thibaut soon stirred, appearing to abandon his efforts to sleep. Yet as he looked around, he noticed a string of horses to the southwest in the field of Missouri, which was still, but swaying their heads about and stomping against the ground. Thibaut very slowly stood up and began to walk east, but seconds later these horses turned and cantered towards him, and he broke into a run as he passed into the field of Ohio. Thibaut jolted around several times to look at the horses that were still moving closer and whinnying loudly, but thanks to his large height and stride, he passed relatively quickly through Ohio, and whilst these horses were still over 100 meters from him, he entered the southwestern forest of New York. Even though Thibaut had run into the forest, he still seemed worried by the presence of these horses that were now irritably stomping and gnashing at each other in the eastern edge of Ohio. He therefore continued running east, towards the beach of New Hampshire. Upon realizing that the showdown of these monumental games was now imminent, viewers in Snow Square quickly exited their tents and looked at the large split screen. However, some viewers were allegedly shocked by the damage to the buildings surrounding the square, along with the billowing fires in the distance that had been caused during the night by radical protesters. Yet fortunately, most viewers in Snow Square were distracted by the screen, which showed Thibaut running east through the forest of New York at a steady pace. When he was roughly halfway towards the water, he heard the squeaking of squirrels in the surrounding trees, which appeared to worry him, although supporters in Snow Square shouted at him to keep running. Thibaut briefly slowed down as he looked up to see a dray of squirrels on a branch above him, but he continued east towards the water, that he seemed able to see through the remaining trees. Although the squirrels then jumped down towards Thibaut and attacked him from behind, he quickly turned and ran backwards, while slicing his dagger towards each of these squirrels. This seemed to amuse some viewers in Snow Square, but Thibault continued running backwards to the east, until he reached the eastern edge of Vermont's forest. After appearing to realize that the squirrels were no longer chasing him, he breathed out in relief and turned around to see the group of tributes ahead on the beach of New Hampshire. Thibault quickly ducked before running north through the forest of New Hampshire, whilst Rubeus commented that he probably had no idea that this group had been together, to which Eugenia replied that he may even feel betrayed that he was not invited into this alliance. Yet as they spoke, Thibault was running north along the western side of the beach, close to where Dazzle could be seen hiding. Meanwhile, Magnus had remained still within the forest of New Jersey, until he heard the horses to the west as they chased Thibault. Magnus grabbed his sword and knives, then ran west, but after hearing the squeaking of the squirrels to his north, he suddenly changed direction and ran towards them instead. When Magnus reached the edge of Connecticut's water just a minute later, he grinned as he noticed the group on the beach ahead of him. Yet after looking to the west, he gasped in delight as he saw Thibault running along the eastern edge of the forest. Magnus swiftly ran after him, whilst Rubeus shouted at Magnus to kill Thibault, amidst excited cheers of support in Snow Square for many different tributes. When Thibault arrived at the edge of the beach, he watched the group, who were now just 100 meters along the beach from him. Eugenia commented that although both Ristoro and Tritica were keeping watch, they seemed oblivious to the increasing proximity of the other three tributes. Magnus was now just 30 meters to the south of Thibault. He carefully walked north through the forest and held his sword at the ready as he moved closer. Thibault was focusing intently on the beach ahead at this time, but he suddenly frowned and jolted around, before gasping and swearing as he noticed how close Magnus was to him. Thibault sprinted onto the beach, and Magnus appeared annoyed as he watched him run towards the larger group. A few seconds later, Tritica yelped when she saw Thibault, and Ristoro quickly stood up with his knife, whilst Olive, Net, and Baffin suddenly awakened. As Thibault ran towards them, Baffin froze on the spot as he watched him. Olive grabbed her axe, and Net stood directly behind her, with her needle at the ready. Yet as Thibault came nearer with his spear in one hand, he raised his other hand in an apparent sign of peace, and shouted that he was not going to hurt them, but that Magnus was back in the forest. Most of the group looked past Thibault, then Tritica gasped as she spotted Magnus running onto the beach. Dazzle watched from the northern edge of the forest to see the group and Thibault appearing to panic at the sight of Magnus, who was now brandishing his sword and grinning as he eyed his targets. Dazzle's eyes darted across the beach, and she spotted Tritica running north towards the thick rocks that lay at the bottom of Maine's Hill, whilst Baffin and Ristoro ran east towards the trident that lay next to the water. As Dazzle watched from the forest, she seemed surprised that Olive, Net, and Thibault were slowly backing towards the rocky hill to the west, whilst holding their respective weapons at the ready as Magnus slowly approached. Dazzle counted on her fingers and appeared to realize that all her remaining opponents were on the beach ahead of her. She grinned, and Eugenia commented that she probably felt rather powerful in this position, until a few seconds later, when a squirrel suddenly jumped down from a branch above her. Dazzle jumped and yelped as the squirrel gripped onto her hair. She scurried forwards onto the beach, whilst trying to push the squirrel from her head, but it was only when she practically threw herself onto the beach ahead that the squirrel squealed and scurried back into the forest behind her. Whilst Dazzle had been watching from the forest, Magnus was slowly walking towards Olive, Net, and Thibault, even though the former threatened to throw her axe, which made him laugh. Yet as Magnus appeared to be deciding which of this trio to target, he jolted around upon hearing Dazzle's yelp of terror as she was attacked by the squirrel. Magnus sniggered, but after noticing that Dazzle was now running towards him and the trio ahead, he suddenly jolted to the east, towards Baffin and Ristoro. When these boys had seen Magnus enter the beach, they ran east, and both seemed to be aiming for the trident, but this was picked up by Baffin, who reached it just a second earlier. Ristoro seemed worried to not be armed with this weapon, but he grabbed the small knife instead that lay adjacent, before turning back to watch Magnus approaching the others. Yet when Dazzle ran onto the beach and Magnus headed towards them, both Baffin and Ristoro held their weapons with even tighter grips, although it was noted that Ristoro was clearly more focused on the trident in Baffin's hands. As Magnus ran towards the boys, he briefly looked back, but suddenly stopped when he noticed Dazzle sprinting behind him towards Thibault, Olive, and Net. Dazzle had stopped just 20 meters from the trio, and she took out one of her throwing knives that she threw towards Olive's head, but Olive ducked and narrowly avoided this knife. Yet before the knife flew past Olive, Dazzle had already thrown the second knife, that appeared to be aimed for Thibault's chest, although he jumped to the side and it only ripped through his jacket. Dazzle gasped in clear annoyance at missing both these targets. Net cowered behind Olive, who seemed tempted to throw her axe, but Rubia stated that she most likely wanted to keep hold of this weapon. Dazzle then pulled out another knife from her jacket, but just as she looked ready to throw it, Thibaut threw his spear straight towards her. Although the spear hit Dazzle's chest, the trio each appeared shocked and then anxious as the spear harmlessly bounced off the armour that lay beneath Dazzle's t-shirt. As she laughed and ran across to Thibaut, he quickly pulled the dagger from his pocket, but no sooner had he done this than Dazzle threw another knife at his shoulder. Olive and Net watched in shock as Thibaut gasped in pain and Dazzle pulled out another knife. However, Thibaut still managed to stumble towards her and narrowly dodged this second knife. Dazzle gasped as Thibaut continued sprinting towards her and she rapidly reached for another knife, but before she could pull it from her jacket, Thibaut collided with her chest and knocked her to the ground. Dazzle screamed as Thibaut fell on top of her, and he quickly brought the dagger down towards her neck, but she used all the strength in her arms to push Thibaut's arm away. He used his other hand to punch Dazzle's face. She groaned in pain, and he brought the dagger down, but she quickly jerked her head to the side. The dagger therefore stabbed into the sand behind, whilst a cannon sounded, which made Thibaut jump and look up. At this moment, Dazzle noticed Thibaut's shoulder, and she quickly slammed a handful of sand against the wound. He yelped in pain and fell onto his back, while she grunted and clambered on top of him. Dazzle finally pulled out another knife and looked ready to stab it into Thibaut's neck, until a needle was suddenly stabbed into the side of her neck. The needle was quickly removed, and Thibaut gasped at the blood beginning to spurt from Dazzle's neck. She briefly appeared confused as she held this wound and fell forwards onto Thibaut. He grimaced as more blood dripped onto him from Dazzle's neck, but just as he was pushing her off to the side, Net lunged her needle down towards him. Meanwhile, by the water, Baffin had watched in shock as Dazzle and Thibaut began to fight, whilst Magnus also watched from halfway between them and the boys. Yet when Thibaut fell to the ground after being hit by one of Dazzle's knives, Ristoro breathed erratically, and Eugenia quickly stated that he was about to act. Ristoro looked down with worry at his smaller knife, then once more at Baffin's trident. As Thibaut knocked Dazzle to the ground, Ristoro suddenly grabbed onto Baffin's trident. Baffin quickly pushed back against Ristoro and shouted at him to get off, before trying to pull away with his trident. Ristoro stabbed his knife into Baffin's neck, which produced shock gasps and no swear. Baffin spluttered blood and tumbled back, whilst holding his neck and glaring at Ristoro, who snatched the trident from Baffin's hands, before giving him a sympathetic smile. Magnus had been keeping an eye on both the fight between Thibaut and Dazzle to his left, and the boys to his right. His attention was swayed by the former, but after seeing Baffin tumble back into the sea and stop breathing, he gasped, and Rubius later stated that he even looked slightly impressed with Ristoro. When Baffin's cannon sounded, Olive glanced back to Ristoro and briefly looked shocked when she appeared to realise what he had just done. As for Net, she gasped, then ran forwards and stabbed Dazzle in the side of the neck. After witnessing Baffin dying, Magnus grinned and slowly turned towards Ristoro, who gripped the trident and gradually walked back into the water behind him before glancing over to see Tritica. She had hidden within the rocks of Maine, but after almost being pincered by a cast of crabs that were nestled here, she jumped out and ran back a few meters towards the other tributes. She was now gripping her knife and watching in horror as the bloodshed occurred. Meanwhile, by the rocky wall, Olive watched in shock as Thibaut narrowly avoided Net's needle when she brought it down towards his neck, but it still passed through his left ear, and he yelped in pain. Net began to pull back the needle, but Thibaut quickly grabbed onto her arm with enough force to bring her to the ground. Thibaut scurried up as Net fell, before punching her in the stomach as she landed on top of him, which made her splutter in pain. Olive ran towards the pair, and Thibaut quickly pushed off Net, before running away from Olive and towards the spear that he had thrown earlier at Dazzle. Net was still coughing in pain as she tried to get up. Olive reached her, but grimaced as she looked to the south to see the fight that was occurring between Magnus and Ristoro. Olive then looked down to Net, who put a hand out and asked Olive for help. However, another cannon immediately sounded, that was quickly followed by more screaming to the east. The girls looked at the chaos within the water, then back into each other's eyes for a second, until Net gulped and gripped her needle as she looked towards Olive's leg. Olive jumped back, and Net's needle very narrowly missed her knee. Net gasped sorry as she tried to jump up, but Olive quickly sliced her axe down onto Net's chest, and her cannon sounded within seconds. Olive responded, sorry, and jolted back to Thibaut, who had been watching from where he had collected his spear. Olive looked at Thibaut with a sorrowful expression, then slowly turned towards him, but he was now looking just beyond her. Meanwhile, Magnus was brandishing his sword as he walked towards Ristoro, who gripped onto the trident. but Magnus grinned before suddenly charging towards him. Ristoro gulped and stepped back slightly, but as Magnus ran forwards with the sword, he suddenly pulled out a knife, which he threw at Ristoro's shoulder. Magnus laughed as he slowly continued towards Ristoro, who was now screaming in pain within the water. Yet to the surprise of viewers and Magnus himself, Ristoro managed to get to his feet and yelped as he pulled out the knife from his shoulder. Magnus scoffed and swiped his sword at Ristoro, who quickly held out his trident in defence. For almost 10 seconds, Magnus continued to laugh and slice his sword towards Ristoro, but to the surprise of many cheering viewers in Snow Square, Ristoro was still blocking these swipes with his trident. Yet after quickly glancing over his right shoulder to see Olive standing over Net, Magnus pulled out another knife from his pocket, which he threw with his other hand towards Ristoro's chest. The knife hit his heart, and seconds after falling back into the water, his cannon sounded. Magnus grinned and looked over his shoulder once more to see that neither Olive nor Thibaut were looking towards him. Magnus slowly leaned down and pulled the knife from Ristoro's chest, yet when he stood up again, Tritica silently ran in from behind and gnashed her teeth in anger as she jumped onto his back. Magnus gasped in surprise and stabbed his sword over his shoulder. Tritica yelped when the sword hit her hand, and Magnus tried to push her off. However, Tritica was gripping her knees so tightly into Magnus's sides that she remained on his back, and he slipped forwards into the water. Tritica then stabbed her knife down into his right eye. Magnus screamed in pain and dropped his sword as blood splattered into the water. Tritica shouted that he had killed her friend before stabbing his left eye, and he screamed even louder. Tritica continued stabbing Magnus's face in a frantic manner until his cannon sounded just 10 seconds later. She gasped and looked at the blood on her hands, then turned to watch as Dazzle threw a knife into Olive's back. Although Net had stabbed Dazzle in the neck almost a minute prior, it was seen on a replay that she had avoided any major artery. Dazzle was bleeding heavily from this wound as she lay on the ground, but she managed to cover it with the collar of her jacket before using all her apparent energy to get to her knees. Olive had been walking slowly towards Thibaut with her axe at the ready. However, he remained still and watched as Dazzle threw a knife into the centre of Olive's back, which caused her to scream and fall to the ground. Olive yelped and desperately tried to reach the knife with her hand as she painfully turned around. She panted in pain and looked back to see Dazzle, who threw another knife into the side of her head. Olive fell to the ground and her cannon sounded, whilst Dazzle looked ahead to see Thibaut, who was still gripping his spear in shock. Dazzle used one hand to adjust the collar on her neck, and the other hand to pull a knife from her pocket. However, as she looked at Thibaut, he held his spear and watched her intently. Dazzle spluttered a little more blood, and although Thibaut was still a fair distance from her, she threw this knife, which flew off several feet from him. Dazzle gasped in pain as she tried to grab another knife, but Thibaut sprinted towards her and threw his spear into her chest. As Dazzle's cannon sounded, the hovercraft entered through the central ceiling of the arena to the southwest. Thibaut turned around and watched Tritica, who was still shaking with blood on her hands as she turned towards him. She whimpered as he slowly walked towards her with his spear, but she held her knife in front of her with both hands, wide-eyed, shaking, and breathing quickly as he moved closer. Although cheers, screams, and fights were now raging within Snow Square, Thibaut appeared somewhat dazed, and he even slowed down as he approached Tritica, whilst Eugenia frantically asked why he did not just throw the spear. Tritica glared and kept her knife held firmly in front as Thibaut walked to within just 10 meters of her. She gradually stepped back into the water, then growled at him to not come any closer. Thibaut took a few more steps forward, and Tritica began to cry as she stepped further back through the water. Yet Thibaut suddenly stopped moving, before closing his eyes, smiling, and letting out a quiet chuckle as he reopened his eyes. Although Tritica was clearly scared, she also appeared perplexed by this sudden change in Thibaut's mood. Yet just as Rubius asked what the Scotland Thibaut was doing, he looked around at the perimeter and up towards the hovercraft that was now almost above them, before sarcastically shouting that he could be their hero. Whilst the cheers in Snow Square quickly quietened, Thibaut held up his spear and loudly asked why bloodshed and murder should be rewarded, then asked how much longer the capital expected the lives of all district citizens to be ruined by these sick games. Tears streamed down Tritica's cheeks, and Thibaut gestured towards her with his spear, and shouted that they wanted him to kill her right now and live a wonderful life. Yet Thibaut then scoffed, and asked how his life could ever be anything but a nightmare, when his wife and daughter had already been killed, no matter how many disgusting capital riches were given to him. Thibaut took out his dagger and held it to his neck, whilst Tritica's breathing hastened and she gasped. He insulted President Snow in a very vulgar manner before slitting the blade across his throat. As Thibaut collapsed to the ground, outrage sounded in Snow Square, with many of his supporters clearly furious at this selfish act. Tritica yelped in disgust as blood poured out from Thibaut's neck, flying so far that it hit her feet, and she tripped back into the water as he shook against the ground. The hovercraft dropped its ladder and moved closer to Tritica, who quickly turned around and breathed calmly with closed eyes. 20 seconds passed, whilst Tritica began to open her eyes and look down at the blood flowing from her feet and into the water, until Thibaut's cannon sounded. A few moments later, President Gall announced that Tritica MacDonald of District 9 was the victor of the 100th Hunger Games. Peacekeepers descended from the ladder of the hovercraft and hurried towards Tritica, while she slowly turned towards them and blinked in apparent shock. They pulled her up from the ground, and she walked with them from the water and onto the hovercraft's ladder. It was clear that many viewers in Stowe Square were livid with the outcome of these games. There was allegedly a general sentiment that Tritica did not deserve victory, and even viewers who did not support District 11 voiced their beliefs that Thibaut should have emerged victorious. In fact, over the rest of this day, a series of horrific riots occurred throughout the capital, which produced a record amount of looting, damage, injuries, and even deaths. Many historians still debate to this day as to why these riots were so violent, although it is generally agreed that there were several combined reasons. Firstly, there had been ongoing unrest within the capital caused by the measles pandemic, insecurity amongst its citizens following the loss of Districts 12 and 14, and a general lack of guidance from President Gall's poor leadership since the first of the district games had begun. However, this unrest was heightened by the much-anticipated grand final, not only producing an unpopular victor in the eyes of many citizens, but also including a pregnant tribute, whose death had greatly angered a number of more liberal citizens. Over that day, rumours also spread throughout the capital that several European powers were threatening to fire missiles directly towards the city, unless President Gall agreed to permanently abolish the Hunger Games. Yet there are no recorded threats on this day towards the capital from any European powers, and it is now agreed by most historians that these rumours were deliberately started by agents of Unidad within the capital, in order to exacerbate the already rampant unrest. Over that day, a lot of damage was targeted directly towards the houses of several leading commanders. Along with the threat of a missile attack and the lack of direction from President Gall, several of these commanders who owned their own hovercraft decided to flee from the capital, with many reported to believe that this escape would be temporary until the unrest was pacified. Amongst these commanders was your great-great-grandfather, Coriolanus Snow II, whose hovercraft departed from the capital as the sun set. Also on board was Snow's wife, Narcissa, his 5 children, including your great-grandfather, Coriolanus Snow III, his private security team, and the families of several close friends whom he had agreed to shelter when the unrest started. It is known that several days later, a conflict involving nuclear missiles almost occurred between Panem and several European powers. However, the newly elected President Cardew managed to stabilize this conflict, and a peace treaty was created between Panem and these nations, in order to ensure that a situation like this never occurred again. It is believed by historians that there was no more conflict between Panem and the European powers for several more decades, whilst the latter returned to fighting between themselves. It is also theorized that the effect of the pandemic and loss of District 12 would have affected future years of the Hunger Games. Citizens who arrived in our land the next year reported that the 101st Hunger Games occurred the next year, although it was received poorly by the capital. It is not known how long the Hunger Games continued after the year 113, or if they even continued at all, as we have never accessed any further records. Meanwhile, in the aftermath of the 100th Hunger Games, Coriolanus Snow II and his entourage successfully fled the capital and flew directly to the abandoned city of New York, in the northeastern corner of Panem. Apparently by using a secret code, Snow was one of several commanders who communicated that they would meet close to the Empire State Building, arena for the 69th Hunger Games, if they were to escape the capital, and a total of 278 capital citizens reconvened here. Although the commanders and their entourages were at first able to live safely in this building, they were spotted after a few days by a passing hovercraft that is believed to have belonged to the recently reformed country of Scotland. This hovercraft was quickly ordered to be shot down by Commander Severo Wimseywick, so that it could not report the location of these citizens. However, after an emergency meeting, it was decided that they needed to move on from New York City in order to ensure that their location remained secret from any of the European powers. During this meeting, it was in fact suggested by Coriolanus Snow II that they travel across the Atlantic Ocean to the wastelands of England, although the suggestion was initially met with confusion and even some ridicule. However, Snow soon convinced the other commanders and members of their entourages that they would never be safe within Panem. He also argued that the European powers would never expect them to be hidden so close to Europe, and in a former country that many believed to be uninhabitable after the Rose Wars, even though recent capital research had shown certain areas to be habitable. Therefore, that night, the capital hovercrafts crossed the Atlantic Ocean and entered the airspace of England without being spotted by any European radar system. The capital crafts then landed in England, close to an area known as Land's End. For the next few weeks, several exhibitions were launched throughout different areas of the country until a suitable location for living was found in the county of Sussex, to the south of the former megacity of London. Shortly after creating a new settlement in the wastelands of England, that our ancestors named the new capital, they learned to their surprise that there were still several functioning settlements nearby. During the next few years, your great-great-grandfather, Coriolanus Snow III, led successful efforts to integrate with the populations of these settlements, and capital goods and services were traded in exchange for their expertise on living in these lands. As more children were born into the new capital, our ancestors began to blend the old capital way of life with a local English culture, and our settlement grew even further until it was larger than the combined size of all of theirs. Furthermore, a large library was opened last year in the new capital, in which all the Hunger Games and the events surrounding them have safely been stored. It's from there that I've taken these stories and read them to you, Arabella. One can never trust everything that is written in history, and what I've read to you over the last year may not be completely accurate. The only ones who would know for sure are those who are in Panem.
Where we go back?
Maybe one day, but I feel like there are closer targets to hand.
Be close to targets.
Yes. And so that is the end of Tales of the Hunger Games. I just wanted to give a big thank you for everyone who's been watching, everyone who's enjoyed the series, everyone who's commented, and who's been there along the way. I've met some brilliant people making this series and seeing the comments. I'd like to give massive thanks as well to Andrew McLean for all the amazing art that he has produced for this series. It wouldn't have been the same without him. And also to Lauren McCouch for all the writing that she has also done for the series as well. I really recommend checking the links in the description as well, if you haven't already checked them. And Cleo would also like to say thank you when she stopped licking herself, Cleo. If you heard anyone snoring over the years, it was her. Alright, she's busy. So now I'm going to have a rest for a bit. Writing has been an amazing experience, but it has been quite exhausting at times. I will certainly be back though in the future. For now, I am restarting a job in teaching. As much as I've loved the series, it hasn't always been the best way to make money. So I do need to, make a little bit of money now. In the future though, I am thinking of coming back to some of the early games and doing them in a bit more detail. And it could be sometime in 2022, I'd say, around then, but I will, of course, keep you all informed. For those of you who follow me on Patreon, I recommend cancelling for now, just so you're not paying for anything that doesn't come out. And I do have another series planned, another idea. It's not in Hunger Games universe or anything like that, but I think if you enjoy my writing, you might enjoy that as well. So, we could see. Several other people are also trying to carry on this series, and to them I say, good luck doing it. Take your time, don't be impatient. Have fun with it though. have fun. They're your characters. Do what you want with them. Yes, maybe don't record when you got a dog in the room. But I just wanted to say once again, thank you so much for having been there all the way. It's been a trying time around the world, but whenever I see that this has helped people during this time, it has made things a lot better, and it has really made things worthwhile for me. And it wouldn't have been the same without all your support and everything like that. So I just want to say a big thank you. And wherever you are, no matter what's going on, no matter who's being a mean person to you, may the odds be ever in your favour.